The red dust of Kepler 442b swirled around Hyunwoo Kim as he crouched behind the metal storage container, and his heart beat fast in his chest while he watched the alien guards patrol the supply depot, and he knew this mission would either save his people or kill him and his sister. But there was no other choice left for humanity, and the Kalari Empire had taken everything from them already. So what was 2 more lives in the grand scheme of their war? So young Kim crawled through the ventilation shaft above the main warehouse, and her small frame allowed her to move silently through spaces that would trap a larger person. And she had always been good with machines and computers, even as a child back on Earth before the aliens came. And now, those skills were the only thing keeping the human resistance alive, and she could hear her brothers breathing through the comm device in her ear, and it reminded her of when they used to hide from their parents during games, and now they were hiding from creatures that wanted to kill every human in the galaxy. The Kalari supply depot stretched across several kilometers of the planet's surface, and it contained weapons and technology that could change the course of the war if the resistance could get their hands on it. And Hyunwoo had spent months planning this raid with the other resistance leaders, and they all agreed it was worth the risk, even if the chances of success were small and the chances of survival were even smaller. But humans had learned to take desperate chances since the invasion began. So Young reached the central computer terminal and began connecting her modified datapad to the alien systems, and the technology was strange and beautiful in a way that made her both amazed and angry, because these creatures had such advanced tools, yet they used them only to destroy and conquer. And she wondered what humanity could have built if they had been given this knowledge peacefully, instead of having it forced upon them through war and suffering. The first alarm sounded like a dying animal, and Hyunwoo knew immediately that something had gone wrong, and he pressed his back against the storage container while Kalari soldiers began moving through the depot, with their strange gliding walk and their weapons ready to fire, and he could see their silver armor gleaming in the artificial light, and their faces hidden behind masks that made them look like demons from old stories his grandmother used to tell. So Young's hands moved quickly over the datapad as she downloaded everything she could from the alien computers, and the information flowing across her screen showed weapon specifications and troop movements and supply routes that could help the resistance strike back. But the alarm was getting louder, and she knew they had very little time before the guards found her hiding spot in the ventilation system. The Kalari soldiers moved with purpose and precision that showed years of military training, and they communicated through hand signals and electronic pulses that humans could barely detect. And Hyunwoo watched them search the depot with growing dread, because he realized they were not just responding to an alarm, but following a specific plan to trap whoever had broken into their facility. A plasma bolt seared the air next to Hyunwoo's head, and he rolled behind another container as more shots followed, and the metal around him began to glow red from the heat, and he returned fire with his human-made rifle. But the bullets barely scratched the alien armor, and he knew that their weapons were inferior in every way that mattered in a firefight. So Young heard the shooting below and tried to move faster through the ventilation shaft. But her datapad was still connected to the alien computer, and she needed more time to download the most important files, and she could hear the Kalari soldiers talking in their clicking language, and she did not understand the words, but the tone was clear and they were getting closer to finding her. The plasma fire intensified, and Hyunwoo found himself pinned down behind increasingly damaged cover, and he could smell the metal melting around him and feel the heat building to dangerous levels, and he knew that his position would soon become impossible to defend, but he also knew that he had to give his sister time to complete her mission, even if it meant his capture or death. 3 Kalari soldiers flanked Hyunwoo's position while 2 more provided covering fire, and their coordination was flawless, and he admired their skill even as he prepared to die fighting them, and he thought about Earth and the blue skies he would never see again, and the friends who had already died in this war, and he decided that if today was his last day, then he would make it count for something. So Young finished downloading the weapons data and started on the troop movement files when she heard metal being torn away above her and looked up to see a Kalari soldier cutting through the ventilation shaft with a plasma torch. And she knew her time was up, but she kept working, because every second of additional data could save human lives in future battles. The datapad showed 90% complete when the Kalari soldier broke through and reached down to grab So Young, and she pulled a small grenade from her belt and held it up so the alien could see it, and she smiled, because she knew that even if she died, the explosion would destroy their computer systems and deny them access to their own data. Hyunwoo saw his sister being dragged from the building by two Kalari soldiers, and he stood up from behind his cover and walked out with his hands raised because there was no point in fighting anymore, and he would not let So Young face whatever came next alone. And the aliens surrounded him but did not shoot, and he realized they wanted prisoners, not bodies. The Kalari commander was taller than the other soldiers, and his armor had gold markings that indicated high rank, and he studied the two humans with interest and spoke in accented but clear human language, and asked them why they thought they could steal from the mighty Kalari Empire and what they hoped to accomplish with their primitive technology and desperate tactics. So Young looked at her brother and saw the same determination in his eyes that had carried them through every challenge in their lives, and she knew that whatever happened next, they would face it together as they had faced everything else. And she thought about their parents who had died in the first wave of the invasion, and how proud they would be to know their children never stopped fighting. The commander ordered his soldiers to search the prisoners, and they found So Young's datapad and several small weapons and communication devices and maps of resistance hideouts, but they did not find the backup storage device hidden in Hyunwoo's boot or the emergency beacon sewn into So Young's jacket lining. And sometimes the most important victories came from small oversights. The interrogation room was cold and sterile, and the walls were covered with screens showing images of Earth and other human colonies, and Hyunwoo realized the aliens were trying to break their spirits by showing them everything they had lost, but instead it made him more determined, because he remembered what they were fighting to protect, and why surrender was never an option. So Young answered the commander's questions with truth mixed with lies and gave him information that would help the resistance while appearing to cooperate. And she had learned this technique from other prisoners who had been rescued, and she knew that staying alive meant being valuable but not too valuable, and walking that narrow line required careful judgment. The commander seemed impressed with So Young's technical knowledge and Hyunwoo's leadership skills, and he told them they could serve the Empire and live comfortable lives if they abandoned the hopeless human resistance and helped the Kalari understand human technology and psychology and military tactics. But both siblings remained silent, because some offers were insults disguised as mercy. Hours passed, and the interrogation continued, and the commander became frustrated with their lack of cooperation, and he told them that the Empire had ways of extracting information from unwilling subjects, and that their defiance would only make their eventual surrender more painful. But neither sibling showed fear because they had accepted death the moment they chose to fight. The commander finally stood up and announced that since the prisoners would not cooperate willingly, they would serve as examples to other humans, and their execution would be broadcast across all human territories to show the futility of resistance and the price of defying the Kalari Empire. And this would be their final contribution to the war effort, whether they chose it or not. The central plaza of New Seoul buzzed with activity as Kalari workers set up the execution platform and massive screens that would carry the broadcast to every human settlement in the galaxy. And Commander Veltar supervised the preparations personally, because this event would mark a turning point in the war and show all humans that resistance was futile, and their heroes could be killed like any other creature. So Young Kim sat in her cell and watched the sunrise through the small window and thought about all the sunrises she had seen on different worlds during the war, and how each one had brought new hope that maybe today would be the day when humanity would finally push back against their oppressors. But now she would not see another sunrise, and that thought made her sad but not afraid. Hyunwoo paced in his cell and calculated how many resistance fighters might be watching the broadcast, and whether his death would inspire them to fight harder or convince them to surrender. And he hoped that the other leaders would understand the message he planned to send with his final words, and that they would use it to continue the fight even after he was gone. The Kalari Propaganda Ministry worked through the night to ensure that every human communication device in the galaxy would receive the broadcast signal, and that no one could avoid watching the execution, and they had learned from previous rebellions that public displays of power were more effective than secret executions, and the fear they created lasted longer than any physical destruction. Billions of humans across dozens of worlds received the mandatory broadcast notification, and parents tried to shield their children from what was coming, while resistance leaders gathered in hidden bunkers to watch their comrades die. and everyone understood that this moment would define how history remembered their struggle for freedom. The execution platform stood 3 meters high in the center of the plaza, and it was surrounded by Kalari soldiers in full ceremonial armor, and the weapons they carried were polished to gleaming perfection, and every detail had been planned to create maximum psychological impact on the human audience and show the overwhelming power of the Empire. So Young was brought to the platform first, and her hands were bound behind her back, but her head was held high and she looked directly at the cameras as if she were staring at every human watching the broadcast, and her eyes showed no fear or regret, only a quiet determination that made some of the Kalari soldiers uncomfortable. Hyunwoo followed his sister onto the platform, and the siblings stood side by side facing the firing squad of 6 Kalari soldiers, and the cameras captured every detail of their faces and their calm expressions and their refusal to show weakness. Even in the face of certain death and across the galaxy, humans watching began to understand what real courage looked like. Commander Veltar stepped forward to address the cameras, and his speech had been prepared by the finest Kalari propaganda experts, and he spoke about the futility of human resistance and the superiority of Kalari civilization, and the mercy that the Empire showed to those who surrendered quickly and completely without further bloodshed. The commander explained that Hyunwoo Kim had been responsible for coordinating resistance activities across 3 star systems, and that his attacks had killed hundreds of loyal Kalari citizens, and that So Young Kim had used her technical skills to steal military secrets and sabotage Imperial equipment, and that both siblings had refused the Empire's generous offer of amnesty in exchange for cooperation across the galaxy. Humans watched the speech and felt their anger growing, because they recognized the lies mixed with truth, and they saw how the Kalari twisted every act of self-defense into terrorism, and every attempt to preserve human dignity into rebellion, and they began to understand that there could never be peace with creatures who saw them as less than sentient. The firing squad raised their plasma rifles, and the weapons hummed with deadly energy, and the sound carried clearly through the broadcast equipment and into the homes and shelters where humans huddled around their screens and watched their heroes prepare to die. And many of them made silent promises about what they would do to honor this sacrifice. So Young turned to her brother and whispered something that the cameras could not hear clearly, and the words looked like a goodbye or a prayer, but they were actually coordinates that only Hyunwoo would recognize, and they referred to a location that held secrets important enough to die for and weapons powerful enough to change the course of the war. Hyunwoo nodded slightly to show he understood the coordinates, and then both siblings turned to face the cameras again, and So Young spoke clearly so that every human watching could hear her words, and she said that humanity would never surrender, and that their deaths would not be the end but the beginning of something greater. The words echoed across the plaza and through the broadcast signal to reach every human settlement, and they were simple words that could have been spoken by anyone, but coming from someone about to die, they carried a weight that moved through the watching crowds like electricity and made people remember why they were fighting. Hyunwoo added his own message and told the watching humans that the war was not over, and that every person who heard his voice had a choice to make between freedom and slavery, and that their generation would decide whether humanity would survive as free beings or disappear from the universe as conquered slaves. Commander Veltar gestured impatiently for the prisoners to stop talking, because their words were having the opposite effect from what the broadcast was supposed to achieve. And instead of showing human weakness, they were displaying strength, and instead of encouraging surrender, they were inspiring defiance. And he realized too late that martyrs could be more dangerous than living enemies. The siblings refused the traditional blindfolds and stood with their eyes open and their backs straight and their faces turned toward the cameras, so that their final expressions would be burned into the memory of every human who watched them die, and their courage in that moment became a symbol that would outlast their physical bodies. Commander Veltar gave the signal, and the firing squad aimed their weapons, and the plaza fell silent, except for the whisper of wind across the platform and the hum of recording equipment and the breathing of millions of humans watching from across the galaxy and waiting for a moment that would change everything. The plasma rifles fired in perfect synchronization, and 6 beams of superheated energy struck the prisoners, and their bodies fell to the platform, and the medical scanners confirmed what everyone could see. And both humans were dead, and their vital signs had stopped, and their mission of resistance had apparently ended in failure. But something strange happened in the moments after the execution. And instead of celebrating their victory, the Kalari soldiers seemed nervous and they kept checking their equipment and looking at their commanders as if they expected something else to happen. And the feeling of unease spread through the plaza like a disease. Medical teams confirmed the deaths using multiple scanning methods, and the bodies showed no signs of life, and there was no possibility of deception or trickery. And Commander Veltar announced to the cameras that the human resistance had lost two of its most important leaders, and that others should learn from this example and surrender before they shared the same fate. The broadcast continued for exactly 10 minutes after the confirmed deaths as planned, and the cameras showed the bodies from different angles, and the commander repeated his warnings to other resistance fighters, and the message seemed clear that defying the Kalari Empire would always end in death, and that human technology was no match for alien superiority. But in the 8th minute after the execution, something impossible began to happen, and emergency alarms started sounding across the Kalari base, and red lights began flashing in patterns that indicated incoming danger, and the commander's confident expression changed to confusion, and then to growing alarm as reports flooded in from his communications staff. The sky above New Seoul began to glow with an ominous red light that had nothing to do with the sunset, and long-range sensors detected massive energy signatures approaching from the edge of the star system and moving at speeds that should have been impossible for human technology, and the signatures were too large and too numerous to be anything but a major fleet commander. Veltar realized that the execution broadcast was still being transmitted to billions of humans across the galaxy, and that whatever was about to happen would be seen by everyone, and that the propaganda victory he had planned was about to become something entirely different. And he ordered his communication staff to cut the signal immediately. But the broadcast continued because the human technicians who had been forced to operate the equipment had sabotaged the cutoff switches hours earlier, and they smiled as they watched the alien commander's panic begin to spread to his soldiers, and they knew that the deaths of Hyun-woo and So-young Kim were about to be answered in ways that would shake the galaxy. The emergency alarms grew louder as Kalari soldiers ran through the base trying to understand what was happening, and their training had not prepared them for the impossible energy readings that their sensors were detecting, and Commander Veltar stood frozen on the execution platform while the red glow in the sky grew brighter and more threatening. Captain Do-hyun Park emerged from the shadows at the edge of the plaza with 20 human fighters who had been watching the execution and waiting for this exact moment, and his presence shocked the Kalari soldiers because their intelligence reports had listed him as killed in action 3 months earlier during a failed assault on their supply lines. The human strike team moved with precision that matched anything the Kalari could achieve, and they had been training for this moment since before the Kim siblings were captured, and every member knew their role in the operation and understood that timing would be the difference between victory and disaster. Do-hyun wore the black armor of the Earth Defense Force and carried weapons that looked different from standard human equipment, and his face showed the grim satisfaction of someone who had been waiting a long time for revenge, and he looked at the bodies on the execution platform with respect and anger and determination. The Kalari soldiers tried to respond to this new threat, but they were confused by the simultaneous arrival of the strike team and the approaching fleet, and their communication systems were being jammed by devices they did not recognize, and their commanders were shouting contradictory orders while trying to understand what was happening. So-young's final whispered coordinates had referred to a hidden weapons cache that the Resistance had established years earlier in preparation for this day, and the cache contained technology that had been reverse-engineered from captured Kalari equipment and improved by human ingenuity and desperation, and hidden from enemy detection by careful planning. The weapons cache had been built into the foundation of an abandoned building just outside New Seoul, and it contained enough firepower to equip a small army, and the equipment included plasma rifles that could penetrate Kalari armor, and communication jammers that could disrupt their command networks, and medical supplies that could keep wounded fighters alive. Dr. Hyunji Lee appeared on every screen in the plaza as her signal overrode the Kalari communication systems, and her face was familiar to every human who had fought in the Resistance, and many Kalari officers recognized her as one of their most wanted fugitives and the architect of several devastating attacks on their installations. The doctor had been working in secret laboratories hidden throughout human space, and her team of scientists had been developing weapons and tactics specifically designed to counter Kalari advantages, and they had been waiting for the right moment to reveal their work. And that moment had arrived with the deaths of two of their bravest fighters. Dr. Lee spoke directly to the cameras that were still broadcasting across the galaxy, and she explained that the Phoenix Protocol had been activated by the confirmed deaths of designated resistance leaders, and that retaliation systems throughout human space were now coming online and targeting every Kalari installation within range. The Phoenix Protocol was a carefully planned network of hidden weapons and sleeper cells that would activate simultaneously if certain conditions were met, and the deaths of Hyunwoo and So Young Kim had triggered those conditions because their biosignatures had been linked to deadman switches throughout the resistance network. Every human watching the broadcast began to understand that the execution they had just witnessed was not the end of something but the beginning, and that their leaders had been planning for this possibility and had used the deaths of heroes as triggers for a coordinated counterattack that would span the entire galaxy. Approaching energy signatures in the sky resolved themselves into a massive human fleet that had been hiding in the outer system and using advanced stealth technology to avoid detection, and the ships were larger and more numerous than anything the Kalari had believed humans could build, and their weapons were already charging for combat. Admiral Taimin Choi commanded the fleet from the flagship Indomitable Spirit, and he had been preparing for this battle for 2 years while pretending to be dead and allowing the Kalari to believe they had eliminated another human leader, and his survival had been one of the most closely guarded secrets of the resistance. The Admiral opened a communication channel to the Kalari base, and his voice carried the authority of someone who had spent decades fighting superior enemies and learning how to turn their strengths against them. And he spoke with the calm confidence of a man who knew he was about to win a battle that would change the course of history. Admiral Choi explained that the Phoenix Protocol was now fully active, and that similar fleets were approaching Kalari positions throughout the galaxy, and that the Empire had exactly one chance to surrender before humanity demonstrated why underestimating them had been a fatal mistake. The Kalari had always believed that humans were technologically inferior and strategically naive, and incapable of the long-term planning necessary for effective resistance, and those beliefs had made them careless about security and confident in their ability to crush any human uprising through superior firepower. But the humans had been playing a different game entirely, and they had spent years appearing weaker than they actually were, while secretly building weapons and training fighters and establishing supply networks and communication systems that the Kalari never suspected existed. Captain Park's strike team reached the weapons cache and began distributing equipment to resistance fighters who had been hiding throughout New Seoul and waiting for the signal to reveal themselves. And within minutes, the city was filled with humans carrying plasma weapons that could challenge Kalari armor and technology. The Kalari defenders found themselves facing enemies who knew their weaknesses and had weapons designed to exploit them, and the humans moved through the city with the confidence of people fighting on familiar ground against opponents they had studied carefully and planned to defeat. Dr. Lee continued her broadcast and revealed that human scientists had been analyzing Kalari technology for years, and had discovered ways to disrupt their shields and penetrate their armor and jam their communications, and that every advantage the Empire thought it possessed had been turned into a vulnerability. The Phoenix Protocol included sleeper agents who had been placed in Kalari installations throughout the galaxy and had been waiting years for activation, and these agents now began sabotaging critical systems and providing intelligence to attacking human forces and coordinating strikes on the most important targets. Commander Veltar realized that the confident superiority he had displayed during the execution had been based on incomplete information, and that the humans had been planning this counterattack for much longer than he had imagined, and that his propaganda victory was becoming a strategic disaster. The Kalari communication networks began failing as human jammers and computer viruses attacked their systems, and the carefully coordinated Empire military machine started to break down into isolated units that could not communicate with each other or receive orders from their commanders. Human resistance cells throughout the galaxy began reporting successful attacks on Kalari installations, and the pattern was always the same, with hidden weapons caches being opened and sleeper agents revealing themselves, and carefully planned strikes targeting the most vulnerable points of Empire infrastructure. The The red glow in the sky grew brighter as the human fleet moved into attack position, and their weapons charged with energy levels that the Kalari had not believed human technology could achieve. And Admiral Choi prepared to demonstrate that humanity's greatest strength had always been their ability to adapt and overcome. The broadcast that was supposed to show human weakness instead became documentation of the moment when the balance of power in the galaxy shifted and billions of humans watching realized that their leaders had never given up and had been preparing for this day since the first alien ship had appeared over Earth. Commander Veltar looked at the bodies of Hyunwoo and So Young Kim and began to understand that their deaths had not been a victory for the Empire, but the activation key for a weapon system that would destroy everything the Kalari had built, and that the siblings had known exactly what their sacrifice would accomplish. The Phoenix Protocol revealed itself to be more than just a military operation, but a complete restructuring of human resistance from scattered guerrilla groups into a coordinated fighting force with advanced weapons and strategic planning that matched anything the Kalari could field against them. The human fleet dropped out of hyperspace in perfect formation, and Admiral Choi watched from the bridge of the Indomitable Spirit as his ships took attack positions around the Kalari base, and he felt the satisfaction of a plan that had taken years to develop finally coming to fruition. And he thought about all the friends who had died waiting for this moment. The Kalari orbital defenses activated automatically and began firing at the approaching human ships, but their weapons encountered shields that absorbed the plasma blasts without damage, and the aliens realized too late that human technology had advanced far beyond what their intelligence reports had indicated. Captain Park led his strike team through the streets of New Seoul, and the city had transformed from a peaceful administrative center into a battleground where humans emerged from hiding places with weapons that had been cached for this exact moment, and the Kalari found themselves fighting an enemy that knew every building and alley. The Phoenix Protocol had been designed to activate simultaneously across dozens of worlds, and as the human fleet engaged the Kalari forces above New Seoul, similar battles were beginning on every planet where the Empire had established a significant presence, and the aliens were discovering that their conquered territories were full of hidden enemies. Dr. Lee coordinated the global attack from her secret command center, and her screen showed the status of operations throughout human space, and every indicator showed that the plan was working better than even the most optimistic projections had predicted, and she allowed herself to smile for the first time in months. The Kalari had always relied on their technological superiority to maintain control over conquered populations, but the humans had spent years studying captured alien equipment and learning how it worked and then building weapons specifically designed to counter every advantage the Empire possessed. Human fighters in the city carried plasma rifles that fired projectiles capable of penetrating Kalari personal shields, and their armor was made from materials that distributed energy weapon impacts across a wider area and reduced the effectiveness of alien weapons, and their tactics had been developed through careful study of enemy weaknesses. The orbital battle intensified as more Kalari ships arrived to defend the system, but Admiral Choi's fleet had been positioned to control the hyperspace entry points, and his ships used weapons that created energy disruption fields around enemy vessels and prevented them from jumping to safety or calling for reinforcements. The Indomitable Spirit engaged a Kalari heavy cruiser that outmassed the human flagship by a factor of 3, but the alien ship discovered that size meant nothing when facing weapons designed to overload their reactor cores and disable their life support systems and turn their own power against them. Commander Veltar watched the battle from the plaza and realized that his soldiers were losing ground throughout the city, and that the orbital defenses were failing, and that reinforcements were not coming, because the human fleet controlled space around the planet and had cut off all communication with the rest of the Empire. The Kalari military had been built around the assumption that their enemies would fight conventional battles using inferior technology, but the humans had rejected those assumptions and instead created asymmetric warfare tactics that turned every alien strength into a liability and every human weakness into an advantage. So Young Kim's technical knowledge had been crucial in developing the computer viruses that were now attacking Kalari systems throughout the galaxy, and her programs were designed to spread through their networks and disable critical functions while appearing to be routine maintenance routines, and they worked with devastating effectiveness. The weapons cache that So Young had died protecting contained not just guns and ammunition, but also communication equipment that allowed human forces to coordinate their attacks in real time and share intelligence about enemy movements and adapt their tactics to changing battlefield conditions. Human resistance fighters throughout New Seoul began converging on the central plaza, where the execution had taken place, and they moved with the precision of soldiers who had trained for years for this specific battle, and they carried weapons that could challenge the best the Empire had to offer. The Kalari defenders found themselves trapped in a shrinking perimeter around the government complex, and their communications were jammed, and their supply lines were cut, and their air support was being systematically destroyed by human fighters who seemed to know exactly where every alien ship would be. Admiral Choi opened a communication channel to Commander Veltar and offered him one final chance to surrender before the human fleet began the orbital bombardment phase of their attack, and his voice carried the calm authority of someone who had already won the battle and was simply deciding how many enemies would survive it. The commander looked around the plaza at his remaining soldiers and saw fear in their faces for the first time since the war began, and he realized that the execution he had staged to demonstrate Kalari power had instead revealed the Empire's fundamental weakness, and had triggered a response that would destroy everything they had built on this world. The Phoenix Protocol included provisions for liberating human prisoners held in Kalari facilities, and rescue teams began hitting detention centers throughout the city and freeing people who had been captured during previous resistance operations, and many of these prisoners immediately joined the fighting with a fury that surprised even their rescuers. Dr. Lee's broadcast continued throughout the battle, and she provided real-time updates on the progress of operations across the galaxy, and her reports showed that the coordinated human uprising was succeeding beyond all expectations, and that Kalari forces were retreating from multiple star systems. The human fleet began its bombardment of the Kalari base, and their weapons created pillars of fire that reached from orbit to the surface, and each strike was precisely targeted to destroy military installations while avoiding areas where human civilians were sheltered, and the accuracy demonstrated years of careful reconnaissance. Buildings that had housed Kalari administrative offices and military headquarters began to collapse under the year orbital bombardment, and the aliens realized that the humans had detailed knowledge of their base layout and had planned their attacks to cause maximum damage to critical infrastructure while minimizing collateral casualties. Captain Park reached the government complex, and his strike team engaged the Kalari elite guard in fierce combat, and the aliens fought with the desperation of soldiers who knew they were losing. But the humans had advantages beyond superior weapons, and they were fighting to liberate their own world from occupiers. The battle for the complex was brutal, and close-quarters combat that tested every skill the human fighters had learned during years of resistance warfare, and they moved through the buildings like ghosts, and struck from unexpected directions and used the aliens' own tactics against them with lethal effectiveness. The Kalari communication systems finally collapsed completely under the combined assault of human computer viruses and jamming devices, and electromagnetic pulse weapons, and the Empire forces found themselves isolated and unable to coordinate their defense or call for help from other star systems. Admiral Choi watched from orbit as the city below began to burn, and he knew that similar scenes were playing out on worlds throughout the galaxy. As the Phoenix Protocol activated hidden human forces and turned the Empire's conquered territories into battlegrounds where the aliens were outnumbered and outgunned. The Phoenix Protocol had been more than just a military plan, and it represented a complete transformation of human resistance from scattered guerrilla bands into a coordinated fighting force with advanced weapons and strategic intelligence that could challenge the Empire on equal terms for the first time since the war began. Commander Veltar made his final stand in the plaza, where he had executed the Kim siblings, and as human fighters closed in around his position, he began to understand that those deaths had not been a demonstration of Kalari power, but the trigger for humanity's greatest victory, and his propaganda triumph had become the catalyst for his own destruction. The Kalari base burned with fires that could be seen from orbit, and the smoke rose in black columns that marked the end of Empire rule on Kepler 442b. and Admiral Choi watched from the bridge of his flagship as human fighters moved through the ruins of what had once been an impregnable alien fortress. And he knew that similar victories were happening throughout the galaxy. Commander Veltar knelt in the plaza, where he had executed Hyun-woo and So-young Kim just hours earlier, and his ceremonial armor was blackened with soot and his mask was cracked and his soldiers lay dead around him. And he looked up at Captain Park with the expression of someone who finally understood how completely he had been outmaneuvered. The captain stood over. The Kalari commander and his weapon was trained on the alien's head, and his face showed no mercy because he had seen too many friends die, and too many worlds burn, and he had learned that some enemies could never be forgiven, and some crimes could never be forgotten. Veltar tried to speak about negotiations and prisoner exchanges and the customs of civilized warfare, but Park cut him off with a gesture and explained that the time for civilized behavior had ended when the Empire decided to execute civilians on live broadcast, and now the aliens would learn what happened when they pushed humanity too far. The orbital bombardment continued, and each strike was precisely calculated to destroy Kalari military installations while preserving the infrastructure that humans would need to rebuild their world, and the accuracy of the targeting showed years of careful planning and intelligence gathering that the Empire had never suspected. Dr. Lee appeared on screens throughout the burning base, and her broadcast reached every human settlement in the galaxy, and she announced that the Phoenix Protocol had achieved complete success, and that Kalari forces were retreating from human space on dozens of worlds, and that the Empire's conquest of humanity was ending in flames. The doctor revealed that the coordinated uprising had been planned for over 3 years, and that human scientists and engineers and military leaders had worked in secret to develop the weapons and tactics and communication networks necessary to challenge the Empire, and that every captured world had been prepared for this moment. Captain Park looked down at Commander Veltar and told him that the siblings who had died on this platform had known exactly what their sacrifice would accomplish, and that they had volunteered for a mission that would cost their lives but save their species, and that their names would be remembered long after the Kalari Empire was forgotten. The human fleet in orbit began receiving reports from operations throughout the galaxy, and every message confirmed that the Phoenix Protocol was working as designed, and that Kalari forces were being driven from human worlds by populations they had thought were conquered and broken and helpless. Admiral Choi opened a communication channel that broadcast to every Kalari ship in the system, and his voice carried across space with the authority of someone who had spent his life preparing for this moment, and he gave the aliens one final chance to surrender before he demonstrated the full power of human retribution. The Kalari ships in orbit found themselves surrounded by human vessels that had appeared from hiding places throughout the system, and their technology that had seemed so superior was proving useless against weapons designed specifically to counter every advantage the Empire possessed. The Phoenix Protocol included detailed intelligence about Kalari, military doctrine and command structures and communication protocols, and the humans used this knowledge to predict enemy movements and disrupt their coordination and turn their own systems against them with devastating effectiveness. Resistance. Fighters throughout New Seoul converged on the Central Plaza, and they came to pay their respects to Hyun-woo and So-young Kim, whose deaths had triggered the greatest military victory in human history. And they stood in silence around the execution platform where 2 heroes had given their lives for freedom. Captain Park received confirmation that the weapons cache So-young had died protecting contained not just military equipment, but also detailed plans for reconstruction efforts that would help human worlds recover from years of occupation. And the siblings had been planning for victory, even as they prepared to die. The battle for the orbital space above Kepler 442b ended when the last Kalari warship was disabled by human fighters, and Admiral Choi's fleet took control of the system and began the process of hunting down any remaining enemy forces and securing the planet for human resettlement. Dr. Lee's scientists emerged from their hidden laboratories and began analyzing captured Kalari technology, and they discovered that much of the Empire's equipment was less advanced than they had believed, and that human innovation had already surpassed alien capabilities in several critical areas. The Phoenix Protocol revealed itself to be more than just a military operation, and it included plans for political reconstruction and economic recovery and scientific advancement that would help humanity not just survive the war but emerge stronger and more unified than ever before. Reports continued to arrive from human worlds throughout the galaxy, and each message brought news of successful liberation operations and retreating Kalari forces, and the coordinated uprising was achieving objectives that had seemed impossible just days earlier, when the Empire appeared invincible. Commander Veltar made one final attempt to negotiate, and he offered to provide intelligence about Kalari military installations in exchange for his life. But Captain Park explained that humans had already gathered all the intelligence they needed, and that the commander's only value now was as an example to other aliens who might threaten humanity. The Kalari base continued to burn, and the fires consumed everything the Empire had built on Kepler 442b, and the destruction was so complete that future archaeologists would struggle to find evidence that aliens had ever occupied this world and controlled its human population. Admiral Choi prepared his final broadcast to the galaxy, and his message would be transmitted on all frequencies and in all languages, so that every intelligent species would understand what had happened here and what would happen to anyone who threatened human worlds or enslaved human populations. The Admiral stood on the bridge of his flagship and looked down at the burning planet below, and he thought about all the friends who had died fighting the Empire and all the worlds that had been lost and all the sacrifices that had led to this moment of victory and justice. His broadcast began with a simple statement that would become famous throughout known space, and he said that humanity had demonstrated once again that they would never surrender and never accept slavery, and never stop fighting for freedom no matter what the cost or how long the struggle took. The message continued with a warning to any species that might consider attacking human worlds, and Admiral Choi explained that the Phoenix Protocol was just one of many defensive systems that humanity had developed, and that any aggressor would face retaliation that would make the Kalari defeat look merciful. Captain Park stood in the plaza, where it had all begun, and he looked at the bodies of Hyunwoo and So Young Kim, and he made a promise that their sacrifice would never be forgotten, and that humanity would build monuments to their courage on every liberated world, and that future generations would know their names and their story. The Phoenix Protocol had succeeded beyond all expectations, and the Kalari Empire was in full retreat from human space, and the galaxy would remember this day as the moment when humanity proved that they could not be conquered and would not be enslaved, and their enemies had learned too late that some species would rather die fighting than live in chains. Dr. Lee concluded her broadcast with a message to all humans throughout the galaxy, and she told them that the war was not over, but that the tide had turned and that the Phoenix Protocol had given them the tools and the hope they needed to drive the invaders from their worlds and reclaim their freedom. The fires on Kepler 442b burned for 3 days, and when they finally died down, nothing remained of the Kalari base except ashes and twisted metal, and the memory of what had happened there, and the knowledge that humanity had announced to the galaxy that they were not victims but survivors and fighters who would never give up. Admiral Choi sent his final message to the retreating Kalari fleet, and he told them to carry word back to their empire that humanity was no longer a conquered species but a force that would hunt down anyone who threatened human worlds, and that the galaxy had learned what happened when you underestimated the power of human determination and the price of making martyrs out of heroes.